In this video, we'll be talking about the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. These two acts are some of the earlier examples of how Americans were able to build generational wealth through land ownership. Here to help me with this video today is Kayleen Carter.
Hey guys, I'll be talking to you about the Southern Homestead Act. The Southern Homestead Act awarded land to Americans loyal to the Union, as well as former slaves during the Reconstruction era. This act was mostly tailored to Southern states, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, let's tell them how homesteading worked, Ashley.
Well, did you know that just for $10, the Homestead Act helped Americans buy their way into the American dream and independently build up wealth through land ownership? Today, $10 would be a price of a Starbucks coffee and a scone. Imagine buying an entire plot of land for just a cup of coffee and a pastry. The Homestead Act was part of the United States' desire to settle the West. You may remember this being coined as the Manifest Destiny back in your high school days. The Homestead Act was signed into law in 1862 while the Civil War was still going on, but it went into effect a year later when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The act granted women, immigrants, and former slaves up to 160 acres of land. Homesteaders only had to pay a fee of $10 to make a temporary claim on their land, or they could pay $1.25 per acre. There were some requirements they had to meet before they could receive their land. Some of these requirements were that they had to be head of household or 21 years of age, had never borne arms against the United States, so essentially a Confederate American was out of luck. And they had to have lived on and cultivated their land for 5 years before they could receive their patent of the land. Americans with little or no assets could find unoccupied 160 acres, file a homestead application, and after they spent their 5 years on the land, they could possess the financial independence through their newly owned land. This provided upward mobility, a more secure future for generations of their families. This all sounds good, right? Well, it was good if your generations of family hadn't been enslaved for over 250 years. Formerly enslaved Black Americans started off their homesteaded journey with zero capital to their names. While land offered through the Homestead Act could be purchased at a cheap price, everything else couldn't. Homesteaders needed money to travel, register, plant, and sustain themselves, which could cost them an estimate of $600 to $1,000 they probably didn't have. In addition, the government did little to help homesteaders buy tools or build a farm on their land. Some unsuspecting former slaves were even victims of fraud. Speculators would buy 160 acres at $1.25 per acre, live on it for 6 months, then sell the land at a higher price. After they were freed from slavery, many Black Americans fled to the West to escape the oppressive laws of the South. They generally found that the West, with most of the states being free, offered a better quality of life. To that end, exclusively Black settlements started to pop up throughout the West. Kansas especially acted as a hotspot for many Black Americans leaving the South due to the state's abolitionist traditions. Most of the migration occurred from the years of 1879 to 1881, and some 27,000 Blacks had traveled to Kansas by the time the numbers tapered off. Many Black Americans thrived and flourished in those settlements, but many of them were weary of the hardships of homesteading and continuously disillusioned by it. Incidentally, many were also left stranded while they were traveling. The Homestead Act would stay in effect for 124 years and granted 270 million acres of Western land before it was repealed in 1976 due to the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which placed public land back under federal ownership. While the Homestead Act was an important piece of legislation for settling the West, it did little for the Blacks still settled in the southern states, which brings me to the Southern Homestead Act.
The Southern Homestead Act was enacted in 1866 during the Reconstruction era in the South. This act was meant to operate just like its forebear and granted over 46 million acres of public land to Black and loyal white Americans in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But let's go back a little here. Land was equal to freedom in the eyes of many former slaves who felt that land ownership brought economic independence from their former owners. but obtaining it themselves would prove difficult with little money and no resources. They were either sharecropping, tenant farming, or entering into long wage contracts to eventually have the money to own their own land. Land distribution to former slaves in the South had been brought to life through Special Field Order No. 15, created by Union General William T. Sherman in 1865. This is where the 40 acres and a mule phrase gets its origin. The order stated that 400,000 acres of land in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia that were formerly owned by Confederate soldiers would be distributed for the settlement of former slaves, whose families would each get a 40-acre plot of Sherman land and an added mule, which came later. Following Sherman's order in March of 1865, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to assist newly freed Black Americans in their transition from slavery. Congress added a provision that gave the Bureau the authority to divide abandoned and confiscated land for rental and sale to former slaves. Unfortunately, land distribution would ultimately prove to be a failure. About 40,000 former slaves had occupied these lands until President Andrew Jackson, who had succeeded Lincoln after his assassination, ordered those lands to be returned to the former owners that same year. Blacks who had settled on Sherman land were then forcibly evicted from said land. Fast forward to 1866, and the Southern Homestead Act tries to pick up where Sherman's order left off. The SHA granted 80 acres of free land, which would eventually go up to 160 acres in 1868, to former slaves and white Southerners loyal to the Union. The act would eventually include Confederate soldiers as well. But the majority of decent farmland was already occupied by farmers and white settlers, which left Black Southerners with unmanageable land in the swamp or forest and a lack of agriculture resources such as seeds, tools, and farm animals to work with. In addition, many of the southern states had only one land office, and depending on where the office was located, it could take several weeks for Black Southerners to make the trip to fill out an application. The Southern Homestead Act was eventually repealed on July 4th, 1876. All in all, combined with the original Homestead Act, there were 1.6 million white families that succeeded in owning land compared to only 4,000 to 5,000 Black claimants.
To summarize, many of the emancipated slaves started out with nothing and zero capital, making the Homestead Acts pivotal for them to begin building their wealth through owning land and building farms they could potentially pass down through generations. Though some were successful at tilling the land and surviving the harsh conditions of farming, very few Black settlers and former slaves were able to take advantage of the Homestead Act in comparison to their white counterparts. This is a situation that has repeated itself throughout the past 150 years of U.S. history, with white families having much better opportunities to build wealth through homeownership than Black families. That historical disparity is still reflected in today's homeownership rates, which is the reason for CalHFA's Building Black Wealth initiative.
The Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act of 1862 represented America's last great land policy. It was enacted on the eve of the Civil War and provided that anyone living on land for 5 years while making some improvements could acquire a free title to 160 acres. This act remained in effect until 1900 and provided 400,000 to 600,000 white families with homes and farms. Of all the public land that this act passed into private hands, not more than 11 to 17% was settled by homesteaders. By 1900, most of the land had gone to speculators, who thus acquired the claims to rich Western lands, timber, and mineral rights without having to bid or compete for the wealth. Blacks were unable to acquire any of this last-time giveaway of land wealth. Many were interested, but had their lives threatened by Many were interested, but had their lives threatened by whites and decided not to pursue the free land. The acquisition policy of the Homestead Act was that anyone who tended the land should not have to pay for it. But again, hypocrisy reigned. No one had spent more time tilling the land than Blacks, certainly not European immigrants. Yet, even free Blacks were not allowed to participate in the famous land rush in the West. Both free and enslaved Blacks were forced to delay their land ownership dreams and await the freedom that the Civil War would bring. Blacks were legally freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but the end of their servitude did not result in receiving the compensation that was given to the white indentured servants. At the end of their servitude, white indentured servants typically received a small parcel of land as well as a suit of clothing, farming tools, crop seeds, livestock, some money, and some guns. These were the minimum tools needed to earn a living and protect one's family. Emancipation set blacks free as ignorant, penniless, defenseless, landless, powerless, and non-competitive human beings. Nearly 5 million blacks were made wards of the public, dependent upon handouts, welfare, and whatever they could steal in order to survive. No attempts were made to correct the countries of social engineering to which black slaves had been exposed. They had no homes or friends in neither the South or the North. When they asked for a little help or a hand up, President Andrew Jackson in 1866, with Southern states' encouragement, slapped them in their sullen black faces by vetoing the congressional bill that would give black slaves a mere 40 acres and a mule, a compensation for 250 years of bondage. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Dr. Claude Anderson's great book, Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. This is the second half of chapter 6, starting on page 129, talking about the Homestead Act of 1862. Like he said, white bridges to wealth and power. So how was wealth amassed by white citizens en masse throughout the United States? Because everybody didn't own slaves. From my understanding, the majority of white Americans did not own slaves. So for those who did not have that economic foundation, how were they able to build the generational wealth that we're always talking about these days? And like Dr. Claude Anderson has told us for years, affirmative action programs were created for white Americans to help white Americans pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So while they're continuously telling us that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, they fail to mention that not only were they given their boots, they were given the straps and the hands to pull their boots up, the help to pull their boots up through government programming. And like the young ladies did a great job in the opening video, and like Dr. Claude Anderson is talking about, and what we're going to get into more in this chapter is what besides black labor, because last video was about black labor, but what else besides black labor helped white Americans amass the wealth, have this unequal distribution of wealth in America? Because we always look at this wealth gap, and I know black Americans, and I say this a lot, black Americans, we want to close the wealth gap. The wealth gap not going to be closed until there's an equal redistribution of wealth to black Americans specifically. But if that's not going to happen, then we shouldn't focus on closing the wealth gap. We should focus on becoming a powerful group of people. And in that, we would get the wealth that we need and more, and be able to, but we can't fall into the same patterns, the same societal patterns as our oppressors. Then it will be a moot point for us, because we've done it to ourselves. We just became the black white supremacists, right? But we're learning more and more and more that white Americans, especially the white supremacists, they full of shit and they be lying. And they know the majority of black people don't read. And so if we don't read and we don't do the research, we will never know the answers to the question. And we will take what's given to us, and we'll let anybody tell us that, hey, black Americans are lazy. Black Americans are shiftless. Black Americans are criminals. All black Americans do is just cry, and beg, and want handouts, while everybody else came into this country and worked hard to get what they have. And black Americans need to learn how to work hard. And they're not telling you that not only white people, but other groups of people who come into this country get the handouts. Once again, they not only get the boots, they get the shoestrings, the straps, and the hands to pull up the boots. And that's what we're going to get into today. Uncovering the lies, peeling back the layers of the lies, and exposing the truth about how wealth was really maldistributed to white people in this country to make sure that they remain in a dominant position. So we're going to pick back up on page 130. Southern slaveholders, the leisure class. Until recent times, Southern assault to build and maintain a non-working class of aristocrats that prided itself on a lifestyle of unearned leisure that resulted from Black labor. The Southerners' view of Black and work was based on their definition of work for their exploitation of natural resources. Sitting on the verandas or under an old oak tree became a way of life. It was as much as a Southern reality as a Southern mystique. The South's leisure degenerated into laziness. Blacks were the working class. Whites were the management class that enjoyed seasonal light work. Successful planters bragged about not having to do dirty, hard nigger work. In accordance with the national anti-Black public policy, Blacks remained the working class while whites took credit for being the management or brains behind Black labor, right? White indentured servants, temporary labor only, right? So remember, Black people became the labor class for a specific reason. Black people were not the first choice to become the labor class, but we became the main labor class for a main reason. And we're about to get into that, right? So the dream of living in a world with unlimited free land and economic opportunities appealed to impoverished whites still living in Europe. Many whites were willing to sell or contract their labor to white landowners for an opportunity to live and work in a new world. For the cost of transportation from Europe, many whites signed indentured servant contracts. A typical contract lasted for 7 years, but actually it rarely lasted beyond the servant's 21st birthday. Unlike slaves, white servants retained some personal rights. For example, the right to sue, testify in court, etc. And at the end of their period of servitude, they received monetary compensation and basic necessities for establishing a homestead and earning a living. Remember, he said establishing a homestead and earning a living. Disgruntled indentured servants occasionally renegotiated their contracts in order to receive better provisions, or they simply broke the contracts by fleeing and establishing their own homestead on the frontier land that was available and free to any white person. The instability of the white servant labor force killed the indentured servant system. By the mid-1600s, it became clear that indentured white servants were not meeting the plantation owners' labor and production needs. Moreover, the landowners could not impose complete physical and psychological control over white indentured servants. Therefore, the landowners could not maximize profits. Since the landowners had abandoned using captured Indians as slaves, whites found that Black slavery, which was flourishing in the Caribbean and South America, was the most viable labor alternative. Furthermore, England had recognized the enormous economic potential in supplying slaves to the plantations. Though England had hoped to keep North America as an English nation, labor demands in the North American colonies persuaded England to organize the Royal African Company in 1672 in order to supply and coordinate her slave trading activities in the New World. With the labor questions resolved, the expropriation of Indian land in European whites had to occur as quickly as possible. Between 1607 and 1887, European whites acquired nearly every valuable square foot of Indian land via left. Legal discrimination, I read that wrong. Between 1607 and 1887, European whites acquired nearly every valuable square foot of Indian land via theft, legal discrimination, and occasional purchase, and the violation of more than 371 Indian treaties. They violated more than 371 Indian treaties, and that's just Indian treaties, right? The American government's redistribution of Indian land amounted to preferential treatment or affirmative action for white settlers, especially when combined with the government's facilitation of Black slavery. Moreover, to increase land utilization, some states like North and South Carolina granted free land to white settlers simply for owning slaves. In 1663, these states offered 20 acres of land to every white male who owned a black female slave. Such land awards encouraged miscegenation practices between the white male slave owners and black female slaves. This practice also increased the slave owners' slave holdings and raised the black female to a higher, more acceptable level over the black male slave. The dream of owning freedom and land, which drew white settlers to America and liberated them from federal oppression in Europe, was black people's worst nightmare. It smothered blacks' dream by shackling them into endless human exploitation. Like they said, settlers in America not being able to use Indian labor, the Native American labor, the white indentured servants from Europe, that's not working out. It's not working out like they intended it to, because these people got rights and they know their rights and they exercise their rights. But hey, in the Caribbean and in South and Central America, they got these Africans over there, and all these other places where they got these Africans, and they're using these Africans, and these Africans are bringing them a lot of money. So let's do that. So the white settlers in America, they went and got them some African slaves, and the rest is history, right? That's why we're here. That's why America is the economic superpower that it is. That's why America is the military superpower that it is. That's why America has what it has right now, because of the labor, the free labor that it was able to get from the African slaves that they saw everybody else was using. So they say, well, hey, they got them some Negroes. Let's go get us some Negroes. And with Negroes, then we can grow our money. Of course, you know, they ain't talk like that. That's how the American white people talk. But I'm gonna make them talk like that. We wanted our money. Because remember, Europe was poor. Well, excuse me, not Europe, but average Americans were able to build their wealth off of slave labor. And the ones who didn't build their wealth off of slave labor, they got that through those affirmative action programs given by the American government. Black labor, the greatest source of white wealth. Before discussing more recent ways that whites have created bridges to wealth and power, it would be beneficial to take one final look at the economic impact that Black slavery had on the continuous Black labor, the greatest source of white wealth. Before discussing more recent ways that whites have created bridges to wealth and power, it would be beneficial to take one final look at the economic impact that Black slavery had and continues to have on economics in America and worldwide. A close examination of financial data reveals why whites have been so adamant about keeping blacks in the permanent underclass of laborers. The world saw blacks and their labor as sources of wealth. Black gold. England was the king of slave trading nations. Not only was it the dominant slave trader, but was also the primary beneficiary of wealth produced by slaves in the Americas and Caribbean islands. As discussed earlier in Chapter 4, the English system was the harshest and undoubtedly the most profitable of the 6 major slave trading nations. For example, by 1795, Liverpool, England alone had more than 100 ships carrying slaves. The fleet of ships accounted for 50% of Europe's slave trade. Overall, during the 1700s, slave trading revenues expanded England's foreign trade by more than 700%, and annual slave trade revenues averaged nearly $5 million, which in today's dollars would be nearly $5 billion annually. Dang. Slave trading and the related commercial activities were so lucrative that these activities alone elevated England from a poor nation to the single most powerful nation in the world. So the English, so when we thinking about slave trade and we like to only focus on the Americas, remember, all white hands have blood on them. All white hands have slave blood on them. By 1860, annual sales of slave-produced cotton generated more than $30 billion for England. Meanwhile, English textile mills were still annually manufacturing increasing levels of cotton goods for retail sales. English trading relationships with the American slave plantations were so profitable that England viewed the prospect of an American civil war to free black slaves as a significant threat to the national interest. England was well aware that growth in the English economy and the establishment of its industrial infrastructure was founded upon slave-produced products, right? In fact, in 1844, England announced in the Report of Foreign Nations that since 1808, $4 billion of fixed capital has been invested in preparation for cotton goods that were wholly dependent upon slave labor. England was not willing to lose that large financial investment or the steady flow of wealth from black labor without a fight. In an effort to maintain the institution of slavery that had benefited the English nation for more than 2.5 centuries, England offered to intervene in American domestic affairs in order to prolong slavery. In addition, many within England's private business sector contributed financially to pro-slavery organizations in America. They all seem to work together when it benefits them. So once again, the way we were taught about slavery, we were taught about slavery to look only at the Americans, what happened here in the Americas. And we didn't really understand the impact, the global impact that slavery in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in South America, in Central America, in the United States had on the world, even slavery in the United Kingdom, slavery in England and in the British Empire. And we got to remember, you had the Dutch, you had the Swiss, you had the French, you had the Spanish, you had the Portuguese, you had the Germans. I believe you had the Germans. I could be wrong, but you had all these European nations who built their wealth off of slave labor. You got to remember, Europe was trash land, a trash nation as far as no resources, nothing to build itself upon. But using the resources and the labor of the Africans, they became powerhouses. That's why England had that navy that they had at the time before America came and kicked their butt. But as we read, England was in favor of keeping the slave trade going over here in the Americas because it helped to benefit them financially because of slave labor. And eventually, yes, so England is looked at in good light, and the British Empire is looked at in a good light because they were the first ones to enact the abolishment of slavery. But that's after they got all the money that they needed and found other ways to still get money without having their hands looking dirty on the outside. Okay. Wealth provided in the southern states. Contrary to popular myths, prior to the Civil War, the South was not poverty-stricken, but held the greatest concentration of per capita wealth in the nation. Each of the nearly 5 million slaves represented not only a labor device for income, but also a commodity, a negotiable instrument. Slaves constituted a medium of monetary exchange that could be bartered or accepted as collateral when currency and other valuables were in short supply. A white person with a slave never lacked economic opportunity, since his human capital could always be transferred into other forms of wealth if necessary. Ironically, before the invention of the cotton gin, slavery was on the decline. The value of slaves had dropped to an average of $400 to $500 for a prime field hand. At this low market value, some northern slaveholders were setting blacks free in an attempt to cut their losses. More than 30,000 were freed around 1790. But within a decade, prices began to rise and track cotton prices. A half a century later, on the eve of the Civil War, a prime slave was typically valued at $1,600 or $1,800. Land ownership, whites' second great source of wealth, did not surpass slave ownership as the primary form of wealth accumulation until well after the Civil War. The profitability of black slaves as a wealth-producing commodity was so great that anything short of a civil war would have had little, if any, effect on the slavery system. The 7 billion capital investments in black slaves in 1860 extended all other business investments in the North, South, and federal budget combined. The value of a black slave had a direct correlation to the cotton prices. From year to year, as the prices of slaves went up or down, so did the price of cotton. Slaves' value dictated the market value of cotton, and cotton set the value of slaves. The direct relationship existed from the latter part of the 17th century to the mid-18th century. Furthermore, the prices and values varied very little from region to region within the country. Slaves were walking credit cards. Any white who owned a slave could always earn money by either selling the slave labor or selling the slave. Both the slave and his labor earned value. And there were many, 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 many ways for them to use the labor or the value of the slave. Consequently, non-slave owners were decidedly poor than those who owned slaves. And since nearly all of the black slaves were in the South, the nation's wealth was in the South. According to Robert W. Fogel in his book Without Consent of Contract in 1860, 2 out of 3 males with a $100,000 personal net worth lived in the South and owned slaves. The wealth accumulation of the typical cotton belt farm was 4 times greater than that of usual northern farmers, and was 91 times greater than that of a typical urban common laborer. A comparison of northern and southern farms indicates that wealth was disproportionately skewed in the South. On average, the large southern plantation owners who used slave gang systems had 18 times more wealth than the northern farmer, and nearly 400 times more wealth than the average northern urban laborer. Robert W. Fogel claimed that a poor southerner who owned nothing more than 2 black slaves had assets comparable to the average northerner with all of his personal property, livestock, modest savings, and real estate. White wealth created through slavery benefited not only the actual plantation owners, but also numerous businesses in the community. Many Southern entrepreneurs acquired wealth by providing support services and goods to slaveholders. Some Southern businesses could survive by providing services and goods ranging from household effects and farm tools to the leather slave restraints sold exclusively to plantations. This demand was significant enough that nearly 20% of the manufacturing farms that serviced slave plantations were located in the South prior to the Civil War. So, once again, another indication that the majority of white Americans, especially if they did not live in the South, did not have the wealth that the slaveholders had. And so classism always existed. So some of these white Americans, they needed some type of help. But now, let's not just focus on the South when it comes to being able to benefit from slave labor, because we ain't gonna act like the North didn't benefit from it either, right? As in the South, the Northern economy also thrived off the labor of black people through profits from businesses connected to the slavery industry. As contrary to popular beliefs, most Northerners were not opposed to slavery, right? Few abolitionists opposed slavery on moral grounds, but the greater preponderance of Northerners directly, if not indirectly, supported slavery by enjoying the fruits of it, by eating the food, wearing the cotton, and drinking the rum that black labor produced. New England, the home of the Quakers and anti-slavery forces, had 3 times as many textile mills as the entire South. These mills manufactured, processed, retailed, and generally thrived off the slavery-produced cotton. The first cotton mill in the U.S. was built in Beverly, Massachusetts around 1808. By 1817, slaves were annually producing more than 126 million pounds of cotton that had a value of approximately $15 million for processing in northern textile mills alone. So the North, y'all ain't safe. Y'all are just as guilty as the South, right? Numerous historians, including Stanley Liegergott, E.N. Elliott, and Robert Fogel, documented the high productivity of slaves and the products of wealth products and wealth they produced for northern as well as southern businesses. By 1850, more than 1,000 cotton factories operated in the United States. Northern mills processed 1/4 of all slave-produced cotton. This cotton provided clothes, fabrics, jobs, income, wealth, taxes, and other benefits to populations throughout the North. So while Northern anti-slavery forces opposed slavery on normal grounds, it was apparent from the kinds of businesses that were supporting the Northern Company that nearly every Northerner benefited from slavery. Nearly every Northerner benefited from slavery, right? Black slaves produced the raw products for the markets and in turn were a market for the finished products. The textile and leather industries tailored a major portion of their consumer items toward a captured market, the slavery institution. New England textile mills used long strand cotton to make fine fabrics for whites, while the short strand cotton was used to produce the cheapest and coarsest clothes for blacks. The cloth referred to as black cloth or nigger cloth was the lowest grade material that the textile industries could use to produce clothing for 5 million slaves and free blacks. The shoe industry was equally discriminating in its quality. Like the textile industry, the Northeast shoe industry produced 2 different grades of footwear for the South. It produced fine shoes for the white market, which were carefully crafted, expensive leather boots. The manufacturing outlets also designed cheap, rough footwear, such as sandals and brogans for black slaves and freed blacks with marginal income. Judging from public records, there is little doubt that the textile industry and bouderie industries were extremely profitable businesses during slavery, so much so that a few of the original companies were still in existence 100 years after slavery ended, right? So they might not have indirectly had the slave labor, but they benefited from the production of slave labor and didn't say anything about it. Even though some of them may have spoke out against slavery, they were still on the back end using the products of slave labor. How ironic. So let me get into this about Black people being denied access to wealth, right? In the financial sense, Black slaves had the Midas touch. Their labor in Virginia's tobacco fields created the first gold rush. Their labor in cotton created a second gold rush in the fields of the Eastern Midwest. As a result of the war with Mexico over Texas and slavery, California was acquired from Mexico through a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Although immediately afterwards, in 1849, a rural resource, gold, was discovered in California. This discovery of gold ignited a massive influx of wealth seekers from around the world. Within 4 years of the big discovery, more than $200 million worth of gold had reportedly been extracted. The national race-based economic preferences and immigration policies emerged and were adopted in the California gold fields. The two groups who had contributed the most toward the building of the new nation, Indians with their land and blacks with their labor, were systematically excluded from participating in the gold rush. In an effort to keep the California gold rush a white-only treasure hunt, public pronouncements made it clear to free blacks and Indians that if they wanted to pan gold, they could only do it as a slave to a white person. The hundreds of free blacks who traveled to California in search of gold, not re-enslaved, but blocked by the local laws and white vigilante violence. California was one of the few free states, so blacks forced out of the gold fields had few other places to go. Most starved to death, were lynched, or died from exposure. The few who survived were forced to inhabit the worst parts of the town and live commonly in filth or degradation. Like blacks, Indians fared badly. In 1845, 4 years before the gold rush started, approximately 150,000 Indians lived in California. After the gold rush ended, barely 35,000 Indians remained. The intentional exclusion of blacks and Indians from acquiring wealth, or a part of the American dream, had been established into national policy in 1836 by Secretary of War Lewis Cass, who rationalized, We are all starving in the career of life to acquire riches of honor, power, and some other object whose possession is to realize the daydream of our imagination, and the aggregate of these efforts constitute the advance of society. But there is little of this in the constitution of our savages. So blacks and the Native Americans were seen as savages and left out of the gold rush, left out of opportunities. Already the Homestead Act limited the number of blacks who was able to take advantage of it, but also other means of building wealth and acquiring wealth. Blacks, especially black people, were left out of. So now we're talking about black veterans being denied preferential wealth. So many years later, the American government played another role in preferential, I'm messing that word up, preferential wealth distributed to whites. The government passed wealth to the white veterans, both the living and the dead. Through the years, America has expressed its gratitude to its war veterans in a variety of ways, primarily through land grants, land bounties, and homesteading opportunities, except if you look like me, right? In 1642, the same year that Massachusetts introduced slavery into the colonies, Virginia enacted a law forcing blacks to join a militia to protect the larger white society. In 1763, Virginia became one of the first of the colonies to set aside a large section of territory west of the Alleghenies, the Alleghenies. I don't know what that word is. West of the Alleghenies as bounties for veterans. Later in the 19th century, a veteran land program was established by the federal government to recognize and reward servicemen who had served in the wars from the Revolutionary through the Spanish-American War with Mexico. Blacks have participated to varying degrees in nearly every war in which this country has emerged since the year 1619. Yet blacks have received little monetary compensation from any form of their military service to this nation. The Veteran Land Program offered veterans either a homestead site or 6 feet for a burial site. Since blacks were the only non-English, radical, or ethnic group that had fought in every major military involvement since the initial settlement in 1619, they were optimistic that perhaps they would be included in the Veterans Land Program. However, black veterans did not qualify for the homesteading sites. Until the 1960s, black veterans fortunate enough to be eligible for a free 6-foot burial site were discriminated against, even in death. Preferential treatment at most cemeteries and grave sites enforced a whites-only rule. You couldn't even get buried. You could fight for the country, die for the country, bleed for the country, sacrifice for the country, but you couldn't even get buried. So now we're talking about affirmative action for special interest groups, because that's the main thing about this, is highlighting how black people were left out economically, but how other special interest groups were giving the handouts. After the Civil War, when nearly all of the land and wealth building resources had been claimed by members of the majority white society, conservative social forces began campaigns against any governmental program or policy that portioned assistance or redistribution of wealth to blacks. Convinced that the majority white society was well in possession or control of wealth, power, and resources, conservatives promoted an ideology that the right people who are already aboard the wealth boat, so keep the gangplank up. In 1860, 5% of the population controlled approximately 25% of the country's wealth. 130 years later, after the Civil War, 2 world wars, a major economic depression, a civil rights movement, and major possessors of wealth remain unchanged. 5% of the American population still controls 25% of the country's total wealth. Most of this wealth was passed on from generation to generation. The younger generations of whites resist being held morally or financially responsible for the racial sins of their ancestors, though as whites, they still enjoy the inherited advantages and privileges of slavery, right? Ironically, most wealthy conservatives today pretend that they earned their wealth rather than admit that they got it the old-fashioned way through preferential government treatment exploitation of black labor, expropriation of Indian land, or simply as an inheritance from those who acquired it through one of the many combinations of those three ways. Conservative elements oppose reparations or any government programs that benefit blacks, but few acknowledge the existence or oppose systematic government programs that distribute wealth to various special interest groups within the majority white society, right? Despite current political rhetoric, blacks are not the primary recipients of federal grants, giveaways, and subsidies. Historically, the largest recipients of federal government's largest have been railroads, ranchers, farmers, and miners. Theoretically, public lands and resources within the United States are owned by or held in trust for all citizens. Accordingly, the federal government should manage these properties in a way that benefits all Americans. However, the government has not managed public properties in an even-handed manner in the best interest of all, all the people. The federal government has systematically permitted a select wealthy population to use, exploit, and profit from these public resources. These programs frequently never required the recipients to pay anything, and when the payment was required, the payment never approached the fair market value of the public resources. As such, these programs amount to massive taxpayer-funded subsidies to the recipients due to the racial policies and feelings within the nation. At the time these grants were made, the benefits were doled out along racial lines. These programs, some of which continue to this day, can therefore be considered race-based government preferences for whites even now, right? But somehow Americans have never allowed themselves to think this way. The term preferential treatment only applies when federal programs are targeted to provide assistance to disfavored groups. Meanwhile, preferential government programs that benefit the majority group are simply seen as either maintaining the status quo or as temporary assistance to a vital segment of the population in the interest of national security. Majority preference programs are pervasive and so accepted that it is almost a radical notion to term it when white affirmative action. Yet, if we apply the definition equally, this is clearly what these programs are: white affirmative action. White affirmative action. So the railroad companies, just a few examples of white affirmative action programs that were mentioned. Railroad companies, ranchers and grazers got handouts. Farmers got the handouts. Miners got the handouts. These were select groups of white people who were able to get those handouts, those special interest groups. In the 1980s, while poor blacks were denied educational and business opportunities, bank loans, home mortgages, food stamps, welfare payments, and other forms of assistance and federal government headed by conservative politicians administered a system of financial incentives, cash payments, loans, and favorable repayment terms, tax breaks, lucrative government contracts, and other giveaways for wealthy individuals and corporations. These policies, combined with business-friendly legislation, such as refusals to raise minimum wage, amounted to an affirmative action program for wealthy corporations. Common Cause compiled data on governmental preferential treatment policies for those wealth-producing industries. So white people looked out for themselves. White people definitely looked out for themselves, but that's how, as a group of people, as a nation, you build yourselves up, though, right? Blacks were involved in every aspect of the development of the American nation. We cleared the land and produced the crops. We raised the food, the children of the white families. We fought in every war and developed the land expropriated from the American Indians, though we were permitted to be buried only in certain non-white areas of this very land. Blacks produced the wealth that whites in both the old and new worlds possessed and claimed to have achieved by sweat of their brows. The centuries of physical and psychological abuse that Black people suffered were tragic, but even worse, the dominant white society has systematically hidden the fact that the foundations of the American, European, Latin American, and Caribbean economies are rooted in the labor and production of Blacks. Black labor fueled the exponential growth in the economies of numerous nations around the world. For centuries, slave-produced products were found in every home in every Christian and non-Christian nation. Slaves produced raw goods that filled storage facilities, warehouses, and merchant shelves in nearly 2/3 of the world. They provided filters for textiles and clothes, food, alcohol, and raw materials for factories. Black slaves and Jim Crow labor directly or indirectly generated not only thousands of jobs in vertically integrated industries, but also provided what most people of this nation wore and ate. The increased reliance on computers and immigrant labor has all but ended white societies dependent on Black muscle power. Right? Yet, the planned obsolescence of Black labor will only exacerbate the 600-year Black Holocaust. Second-class citizenship will only end when Blacks can recognize political, economic, and social trends and policies that were detrimental to them as a group and collectively demand either an end to such practices or inclusion as beneficiaries of such practices. These words were kicking my butt today. As beneficiaries of such practices. America brought us here to be labor, and they want to keep us that way. There's been a clear separation in wealth and class for a reason. They are here, we are here. They're the dominant, we are the subordinate. We have a choice to make in what we want to do if we want to remain subordinate to the people that we call savages, and they call us savages. So this video went from page 129 to 154. From 129 to 154, that's the second half of chapter 6, which is white bridges to wealth and power. And remember, at the beginning of the chapter, he says, the strength of the powerless is its knowledge of the powerful. Know your enemies. The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful. So 129 to 154, second half of chapter 6. Pull yourself up from your bootstraps, they say. Make your own way. Build up for yourself while failing to tell you that handouts were used to help them build themselves up. So our next video will be covering chapter 7, a national public policy on Black people. Chapter 7 goes from 154 to, let's see, from 154 to 172. So our next video is from 154 to 172. Chapter 7, a national public policy on Black people. Hey, we read this information to know more about ourselves, our history, but also our enemies. Know thyself, know thy environment, know thy God, know thy people, know thy enemy, and know a way to uplift and empower yourself. We can do something amazing for ourselves if we just choose to. Make sure in your everyday lives that you are putting your best foot forward. Make sure the stuff that we're talking online, we're actually replicating in real life to produce tangible results. Let's make sure we're not the ones that's just talking, but we are literally doing what we're supposed to do to make our community better, our nation better, and be a more competitive, powerful group of people that are respected in the world, no longer spit on or stepped on by those that we call savages. So remember that. Like this video, comment, subscribe, share. Remember, if you don't like this video, if you don't hit that like button, if you don't hit that like button, then you don't like Black people, you don't like Dr. Clark Anderson, you like Black labor, white wealth, you like white people building up wealth, you like racism, you like white supremacy. If you don't hit that like button, I'm just playing, but Hit that like button for real. Let's make sure we run it up. Let's make sure more people get this information. Let's not just read it. Let's not just consume it for the intent of intellectual masturbation, but let's consume it so we can use it. It is the fuel that we need to make ourselves better. Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. Great book. We picking back up on chapter 7 next video. Love you all. Happy Monday. Enjoy your Monday. Enjoy yourselves. Peace out.